All right, we're rolling.
Okay.
Endnotes. Number 3. Gender, race, class, and other misfortunes. That's the name of the edition, and we're reading the editorial. Content straight to your brain. So, it's just a short little editorial, about 10 pages or so. Yeah, 10 pages. Just goes over, basically, like, summarizes the content that is going to come in this edition of the Endnotes journal. And, their motivation, the historical context. It's, when number 2 was published in 2010?
2010.
So 3 years separating these two editions. And as they say, we didn't want to rush to conclusions for the sake of being topical. It's Endnotes is all about, being slow and laborious, really spending your time with the concepts and the phenomena in question. All right, editorial. Just a summary. What are we gonna do here? New struggles. What is the general thing that they're saying? Basically, it's continuing their anti-programmatism that they've developed over the course of the last edition, and continuing to argue for why communization is the necessary manner in which a communist revolution will be achieved. Kind of looking at some of the class struggle that's going on. What was happening in 2013? I could barely even remember. I was 23 at the time. I think that I was still on the road. I was still like a hobo, probably in the United States or on the West Coast, and I had not returned to Montreal for my second for my the period that continues to this day. The period of my Montreal phase that is still ongoing.
I had actually not moved to Montreal yet. I had just gotten back from like hitchhiking around in similar fashion. I was living on the east coast of Canada, working at a Michael's Arts and Craft Supplies.
Nice.
I was like covered in glitter.
Why were you covered in glitter?
Because I worked at Michael's Arts and Craft Supplies.
So did they get like vats of glitter and you had to put them into bags or something?
Yeah, you had to that's how they did it. It was kind of like...
Wow, it's like
you had to go down in the
flac.
vat and cover yourself in glitter and then shake yourself off in the bag.
It's like a bulk store but for glitter.
Yeah.
You just shovel glitter into a bag, and that's pretty funny.
This was actually one of my first proper jobs that tied us back to capitalism.
First and few. I've had a pretty good track record with not having jobs. I think I'm still at less than 10 total, and I'm almost 30. Sick.
I've been unemployed more than I've been employed in my adult life.
Way to go. Way to buck the system.
It's possible.
Yeah, all you have to do is start a podcast.
Yeah, and live off canned mackerel from the dollar store.
Ew. Disgusting. But what was happening in the world? I have no recollection. We both were completely out of it, and
Obama was president.
Yeah.
I think things were not chill, but certainly compared to 2020, there was this weird thing in 2012, this new sincerity movement. Do you remember that? Where people were kind of tired of irony culture, and they were trying to be really gung ho. You had these alt-lit poets who were basically making new versions of Walt Whitman and the American Transcendental Movement, and just being aren't clouds great? There was a burgeoning I don't know. There's themes that are prominent now that were just sort of starting to come to the surface around then. But
according to Endnotes, there was a lot of civil unrest, especially in Europe. I vaguely remember riots in the UK and Paris and burning cop cars, but I don't really remember too much of it, and obviously we didn't do any research for this. Didn't actually refresh our memories, just going off of.
Yeah, I mean, I'll admit I was like certainly like a lot less like politically and economically aware. Like I was very much on that like, oh, you know, like all the world's problems will solve themselves if I just focus on like being an artist and going on an adventure, which is a seductive life path for young people in their early 20s, I think, of a certain bent.
Yeah, me too. I wasn't reading too much political theory. I remember I was reading Schopenhauer when I was in Berkeley, and I was reading Spinoza when I was in BC. So I was really I was really enamored with the idea of studying philosophy, and I had some kind of like political sense, but I was more an individualist and didn't really understand like how to approach any of these things. So I just dove into like completely like opaquely dense texts that I had no like historical context or like even conceptual context for, like Spinoza. Reading Spinoza without any kind of context for that is like weird thing to do.
Yeah, like pretty much the main philosophy I was exposed to was Nietzsche at that point, and like also just reading it out of any sort of historical context, just as like, yeah, like affirm your own identity, like just be creative, and like my political identity at the time would just been like generic young person leftist who's like, you know, hasn't really thought about it, is more just a leftist because it feels good.
True enough. Thus spoke Zarathustra is what actually motivated me to give up my life in Toronto and go be a hobo and climb mountains.
Shit, same actually. Don't read
Classic,
those
yeah.
Zarathustra kids, you'll become homeless.
Yeah, unless you want to become homeless. So there's a lot of unrest in the world, allegedly, according to Endnotes, and so that is why I guess in this issue we're going to get more empirical studies. They're going to, be looking at actual workers' movements that were ongoing at the time, whereas in 2010, I guess there was less going on, which is why they were more theoretical and abstract at the time.
Well, you had like the housing crisis, but like even that in itself,
right?
Is,
I don't
like,
think there was.
Abstract.
Yeah, I don't think there was like a workers' movement that came about. You know what I mean? As a result of the housing struggle, there was no
like it was like. I think like there was like this like, oh, things kind of course corrected feeling, like especially in the early parts of this decade, like.
Right. 2013. That's like they talk about it. They like list all of the insurrections that are happening: the Arab Spring, Indignados, Occupy, Takism, as well as plenty of riots. I remember for Tikkun and the Invisible Committee, the Indignados movement was very important, and I think for communists more generally, Arab Spring is like a really big a big one, just because like from my understanding, this kind of like spontaneous movement of the people was able to actually like unseat the regime of the time, but then because there was like a complete lack of any organizing like principle, any organization behind it, like what happened is like some kind of like military regime stepped in and like took advantage of the situation. So like the people, did a great job, like getting rid of the oppressor who was, sitting on the throne at the moment, but then, they weren't actually able to fill that vacuum, so somebody else did. And then I guess like the main argument, if we can say that they're building an argument in this just like short little editorial introduction, is that there's a kind of, it has to do with like the identity of the working class as a subject, and like their kind of thesis is that the working class is no longer, if it ever was, the a viable like revolutionary agent, and the working class is like limited to the boundaries of capitalism, and therefore like under the auspices of like a communization current, then a working class so conceived cannot actually bring about a kind of revolution. I think you know like communization is probably what motivates them to argue against like the quote programmatic understanding of the working class, but at the same time their commitment to value form theory is very relevant here because as we have seen from our episode on communization and value form theory, is really like the concept of value is more pervasive than something that a workers' movement would be able to undo with on its own terms. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. They do sort of go into, because like volume 2 of Endnotes was like largely about the idea of the growing surplus population, and this is something they point to as like a key component of like why this like working class identity can't be like the revolutionary subject anymore. Like, because you would think that a growing surplus population of people that are being like directly like negatively affected by capitalism globally would actually help in the development of this revolutionary subject, but in Endnotes' eyes, it actually like makes it more dissipated. It makes it like harder for the working class to coalesce into like one group with a unified vision. Okay, I'm gonna read the section on the surplus population. Endnotes 2 emphasize the role of surplus populations. Populations with tenuous connections to wage labor. Surplus populations have been expanding due to a secular decline in the demand for labor, attendant on a reactivation of the contradiction of capitalist society. This social form, based on the centrality of labor, undermines that centrality over time. Capitalist growth thus undoes the terms of the relation on which it is grounded. Production of surplus populations alongside surplus capital is the final result of the immediate process of production. So this is something they go into at great length in volume 2. Is this idea that like this is the inevitable conclusion, or the development of capitalist production, where you're continuously trying to like make your process of production more refined and efficient so that you can make more surplus value, which ultimately just reduces the amount of labor you need. You need fewer and fewer workers, and like, but at the same time, you want like a large, population to buy your products. So like, inevitably, capitalism just encourages the growth of this large population that is meant to purchase products, is meant to like take part in the market, but also doesn't really have a role in like the production process because more of it is like automated.
but their idea here is that this surplus population, these people that are largely, as they outline in Misery and Debt, going to be confined either to having to like live off of social welfare, or are going to be relegated to like service jobs, which is like the only real, yeah, exactly, it's the only like real growing sector, especially in the deindustrialized high GDP countries. So these people do not, even as a group, as they are growing in size and number, they do not make a revolutionary subject, because I guess they're like a revolutionary subject in the old sense of like the proletariat, which is like a group of people, is a social class that for Lenin was the revolutionary subject. It was able to like organize and just lead a revolution, and like kind of in Endnotes' eyes insufficiently restructure society. But the revolutionary subject being like the group of people in a population who are going to lead the revolution, who are like structurally and logically like in the correct position, who have like the requisite relationship to capital in order to like effectively lead a revolution.
They're not like unified in any sort of positive sense. Like, they are the producers, they are the factory workers, like, they are the ones actually, like, doing the labor, and they can maybe, like, coalesce, like, an identity around that, like, this actual, like, positive work, but rather than just, like, the people who've been shut out of the capitalist relation, which is, like, and this is something they say here, it is no longer possible to see capital as a mode of production with a future, integrating more and more people into it through development, i.e. industrialization, which perhaps was the case in the early 20th century. Instead, the industrial working class is shrinking almost everywhere. The workers' movement, which previously organized itself around the hegemonic figure of the semi-skilled worker, can now no longer provide consistency to the class, nor can any other subject present itself as the bearer of an affirmable feature. So I think perhaps what they're getting at here is that, yes, there is this growing surplus population, but it doesn't have, like, a unified identity. It's just kind of like something that's been shut out of having an identity, if you will. It's like it only has an identity in a negative sense.
I don't know. Like, I feel like if you look at these, I mean, I feel like they do have an identity, and like, in the Maoist tradition, I think we refer to the surplus population as the masses, which is like a kind of development of the concept of the proletariat, beyond like simply, an industrialized workforce, but is like the identity of the surplus population is that they are the wretched of the earth. They're the people who are shut out of capital. They're the people who are, suffering the most, who have the least to lose from a revolution.
Yeah.
Like they're materially aligned. Their identity is like materially determined by their relationship to capital. They're like traditionally, I think we would call them the lumpen proletariat. Like the proletariat, like Lenin's proletariat, the urban factory worker is now like the labor aristocracy. Like the factory workers, that is like a sick job. You generally are protected by a union. Like you have great benefits, you have great pay. Just because like manufacturing in the West, especially, is so rarefied. Like there's so few manufacturing, so that what does exist here, it's like very heavily protected, and like they're right to say that subject is very hegemonic, and over the course of the 20th century, from the 19th century over the course of the 20th century, that subject, the factory worker, like so much attention has been placed on them, and like so much organizational work has been done to like benefit that worker, because like there was a time when manufacturing did occur here in the West, and like maybe like a large portion of the population was employed there. Yeah. So the people who do work in factories, the people who would traditionally be conceived of as Lenin's like classic proletariat, they are the labor aristocracy. They have sick jobs. They have the most to lose from a revolution, besides perhaps like the bourgeoisie or the petty bourgeoisie. Like they are the furthest from being revolutionized, from being wanting to like do away with the system that is benefiting them. And it's really like the people who are suffering the most who are the closest to like being revolutionary, who have like the most to gain and the least to lose. Like that is what Mao saw. That is why he was able to do his revolution. Like his subject were peasants who like in feudal China were like so horribly oppressed. Like they starved for most of the year. Like they were brutally exploited by the landlords. So the concept of the masses, I mean, I can't really get too much into it because my understanding is pretty sketchy at best, but it's like it's supposed to be like a concept of a revolutionary subject that includes the proletariat, but expands beyond that to include these kinds of people who we would call like the wretched of the earth, to borrow from Fanon. But they're like peasants, they're the lumpen proletariat, they're service workers. They're really just like in order to build up a revolutionary movement, Mao started at the bottom of the rung, not the top, not with the people who are most organized, but he started at the bottom of the social hierarchy and began organizing the people who, have the most to gain, the least to lose. Anyway, I think so. With that in mind, like I would say that the surplus population does constitute a revolutionary subject. They do have like an identity in common, which is maybe it's like a negative identity, but it's still an identity. And they, whether or not there's like a differentiation inside of that group, which is like something that they go on to say, I don't really know how you can say that like this kind of identity-based stratification within the surplus population would be greater than in the population generally. I don't think there's any basis for saying that. So I don't know why you would say that, there's more stratification within the surplus population than outside of it, why they're like, therefore, like less likely to become organized, to have like a coherent identity that they can organize around. Right. Anyway, so they're going to talk more about this in the essay "A Rising Tide Lifts All Boats," which I just noticed is like 80 pages long.
It's a good credit to whoever comes up with these titles, and that says some dope article titles.
Yeah, you like them? Yeah, they're pretty.
Yeah, they're punchy.
Yeah, they're punchy. So next section is called the gender distinction.
Alrighty.
And it's about gender.
Yeah.
And they're kind of like building off of like a controversy or like some kind of discord in the ranks of Theorie Communiste. Theory Communist. TC.
Yeah, which they don't go into full detail about. I mean, they kind of do, but like.
I mean, the basic idea here is that like people, unnamed, this essay came out called "Communization and the Abolition of Gender." It was originally published in Mute, and then it was collected in some kind of anthology. But the idea, like I guess this essay or TC were saying that like the relationship between men and women, for example, you can extend this example to other like identity-based groups, but it is like a contradiction in TC's eyes, but they don't see it as such. Like they see the only contradiction that really exists is what we spoke about earlier, the contradiction of the between labor and capital, the contradiction where like capital sheds off more labor even as it increases its productivity or whatever. Like this tendency to accumulate a surplus population, that is a real contradiction in the logical sense, whereas this relationship between men and women, for example, is not a contradiction, it's an antagonism. I'll read from here. It makes no more sense to speak of a contradiction between workers and capital than it does to speak of one between men and women. In fact, the only contradiction between is the one with which Marx begins Volume 1 of Capital, namely the contradiction between use value and exchange value. The notion of a contradiction between classes appears to be of strictly Maoist lineage. Some have defended its Marxian imprimatur by pointing to a passage in the Penguin translation of the Grundrisse, where Marx refers to a contradiction of capital and wage labor. But the term here is Gegenschatz, opposition, rather than Widerspruch, contradiction. We can find no reference in Marx's work to a contradiction between capital and labor, or capitalists and workers. Ultimately, capitalist social relations are contradictory because they are based around the exchange of equivalent values, measured by the socially necessary labor time of their production, and at the same time they undermine that basis since they tend to displace human labor from the production process.
Maybe I'll set this up by reading the start of this non-class identities section.
Yes.
This interest in gender is part of a more general theoretical turn. The workers' movement privileged the class antagonism above all others because it saw the working class as the future of humanity. If only it could be freed from its connection to capital. The affirmation of class identity was supposed to be the only possible basis on which to overcome capitalism. Insofar as workers self-identified along other lines, that was considered a false consciousness, which was opposed to a true class consciousness. The effect of this orientation was often to emphasize the struggle of certain workers, aka white male citizen workers, over others within the class. Equally, that pushed the struggles of those others into channels where they ended up replicating the productivist perspective of the workers' movement. Women demanded that their labor in the home be recognized as productive via the wage. And formerly colonized populations undertook their own programs of heavy industrialization, with all that entailed, namely a vast toll of human suffering. So in this section, they're basically getting into, like, more concretely some of their problems they see inherent in previous revolutionary epochs. Like the limitations to the scope of, like, their view and, like, their idea of the subject, and, like, how that inevitably led to overlooking large segments of the local and the global population, and how that just allowed, like, basically the capitalist relationship to proliferate in new ways and new places.
Because previous revolutionary movements or previous workers' movements focused on a concept of the worker, for example, the proletariat in Russia, which was, because of the way that the society was set up at the time, composed of like a very particular subset of society. So in that sense, the revolutionary subject of Soviet Russia was white male citizens. I mean, it doesn't really make sense to speak of whiteness in Russia. Whether or not, it was all men is also something that I'm not entirely sure about. I think there are women working in the factories, like quite a bit of them. But that's the idea.
Something Marx points to a lot is that there was, like, women, children. Like,
yeah, absolutely, especially in industrial Russia and industrial England.
Yeah.
But there was no workers' movement that came out of that, so there's no revolutionary subject.
Seems to tie in with, or at least be, like, thematically linked with, like, Endnotes' general criticism of, like, certain forms of communist revolution and their preference for communization, and that like they view communization as being more totalizing,
right?
And how, like, the focus of like the Russian communist revolution was too limited in its scope. It didn't recognize, like, the more fundamental, like, capitalist relationship taking place.
Right, the value form.
Yeah.
That underpins all of social relationships, not just like I don't know, the relationship to the means of production.
Which, like, I mean, consistently every time that's come out, my reaction to it has been like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, but also, like, what they're suggesting is, like, extremely vague. It's just like everything changes all at once immediately.
Yeah, it seemed like they have some kind of like antagonism toward class consciousness, and like they, I guess, ultimately don't really think that it is like that the revolution is really like a question of the working class. Like, it is something else that is going to accomplish that. And I guess, I mean, it does make sense considering that they are value form communizationalists. Like, the working class, like, as they mention in this little editorial, is defined by its relationship to capital, and like their ambition as as like the particular kind of revolutionaries that they are, is to, completely undermine and do away with every last vestige of the capitalist system, which is great.
Yeah.
But it means that like it makes sense that they would want this kind of this more like a generalized like social kind of revolution that is not linked to a subject that is defined in terms of its relationship to capital. Like they would want their revolution to at the same time encompass both the productive sphere as well as the reproductive sphere, and they would want it to cut across lines of like whether or not one has a job, like whether or not one, like how one relates to capital, so that it would want to encompass the surplus populations as well as the working class, but it wouldn't want to be like their revolutionary subject would not want to be defined strictly in terms of its relationship to capital, because like they want to overcome that. They want to and they don't want to overcome that gradually by like installing a dictatorship of the proletariat and then rearranging society from there, but they want it to be revolutionary, to be a totalizing revolution from minute one. You know what I mean? Like
I kind of get, like, I feel like I get where they're coming from, where it's like, I wouldn't want to be like a potential revolutionary subject, but like feel that like my ability to participate in the revolution was contingent upon having a particular like placement in the capitalist structure, because like what I want to revolt against is the capitalist structure itself. Like it feels like what they're calling for is like a form of revolution in which like every member of society can participate immediately. Like there isn't this requirement that it's like, oh, you're a factory worker, or like you can form like this union or something. But again, it's like a very tall prospect, and I am excited to read this volume because I feel like in this editorial they seem to be somewhat acknowledging that like in volume 2 and presumably volume 1, like they were like focusing more on the abstract, and now they want to focus more on the concrete. Towards the end of this this editorial, they do reference this seems to be like a critic, Toscano, who raises like a lot of concerns about the prospect of communization, which honestly, as I was reading them, I was like, yeah, a lot of that resonates with like what I felt reading Endnotes Volume 2, like the need for further analysis to be done for like the potential of like this like new kind of revolutionary subject to emerge, like for more understanding needed to be developed, and like the fact that Endnotes is like bringing that up here and acknowledging it with the suggestion that they're going to like explore these themes more in depth in this volume is very exciting to me, because like a lot of what they're saying about communization like really resonates. Like I want, like it makes sense to me, but I need to see like more of a clear outline of like what actually in the real world this entails beyond just like abstraction.
To be fair, like I don't think that anybody, any communist, any kind of revolutionary today, certainly not in the West, like, or the high GDP countries, is saying anything even remotely, maybe like Trots and like other tankies, but nobody is saying that like the revolution is going to be initiated by people who work in factories, or the revolution is going to be initiated by people who have shitty jobs, or who are unemployed, who are abject in the eyes of the system. And I think that is like a valid criticism. Like the revolutionary subject is not going to be composed in such terms. It's going to be much broader. It's going to have to be defined in some kind of like social way that can like cut across all of these different divisions that exist in the population, all of these different ways in which the population at large, just conceived as like a number of people who, they have all kinds of different identities. They come from different ethnic groups. They have different religions. They have different jobs. They live in different places. They have different backgrounds. They have different educations, blah, 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 different sexualities, different genders. All of these things contribute to like dividing up people and like in some form or another, like segmenting them and, like erecting barriers between these groups of people such that it is more difficult to unite them. In Russia, like they had so many advantages. Like they were facing like brutal repression from the Tsar. There are tons and tons of like revolutionary groups at the time, so they could all like unite behind like this anti like death squad. Like the Tsar was like coming in like kidnapping people from their beds in the middle of the night and like killing people, and like there are like terrorist bombings all the time. That's like relatively common for like decades leading up to the revolution. And there are all kinds of like political groups across the entire country, and like really like all of the workers, like people were really concentrated in like a few areas. You had like peasants and you had like urban factory workers. So it's really simple to organize and unite these people, whereas today people are separated by so much. Like identities have proliferated so extensively, which is great. It's great. And also like people economically are in all kinds of like different situations. So it is certainly fair and correct for them to be like criticizing any kind of like just like dogmatic approach to identifying like a revolutionary subject, but nobody's really doing that.
I mean, like throughout all of this, like this isn't really something that Endnotes brings up at all here, but like I have to feel like the internet is also like kind of a major game changer, because even though you have like these like tech oligarchs who are trying to like control the flow of information, it's still this like global communication platform where even with like these attempts to like algorithmize and like control like what's getting to the public eye, like you have this unprecedented like ability for theoretically anyone and any information to like reach a global audience and spread. And like I feel like all of the movements that they reference at the start of this editorial that were going on in like 2013, like Occupy, like I think something that was shared between all of these and all of the movements that have followed afterwards, like, is that the internet was like integral in like the formation and the organization of these groups. And I think like whatever new revolutionary subject emerges, I think like the state of communication technology is really going to play a key part in that. I don't know what it's going to look like, but like I think it already is.
Yeah, it definitely already is.
For like, and again, like this isn't necessarily an optimistic thing, because also like
it's for better and for worse.
You have like like the return of like pretty extreme ideologies in all directions. Like I think the rise of like fascism and like anti-Semitism, like in the contemporary age, is largely like due to the internet and like certain ideas.
And QAnon, like QAnon is such a contemporary phenomenon, like that fits into this.
I mean, like even like the election of Donald Trump's a pretty good example of this, because like I feel like a lot of like the so-called mainstream media, like the news corporations, were like pretty anti-Trump while he was running. Like they mostly just made fun of him by and large, and yet he still won because he had like strong support on the internet. I mean, I'm not gonna say that's like the only or primary reason, but like I think it is like kind of something you can really point to, where it's like, okay, like the old media structures, the newspapers, the news corporations, like information being controlled by like these like few like this wealthy elite class, basically like the media class, isn't really the case anymore. And like even though there's like a new like sort of tech oligarch class that's trying to form, I don't think it has nearly the same stranglehold as you would have had previously with like TV and newspaper networks.
Well, I think that the tech oligarchs do have the same kind of stranglehold as TV networks, but it's much greater and it's much more pervasive. It's much more insidious. It's much worse. Like the power of monopoly is at an all-time high historically. But I do think that like the internet is going to play a role, like just necessarily, like the internet cat is out of the box and it needs to be figured into our plans no matter what. But I think that like especially in terms of like what we were just saying as of like a talking about like a revolution, like a communizationist revolution where like, you know, everybody in society is participating at the same time and the totality of the revolution is achieved from one moment, from like the initial moment. You know, like organizing on the internet and like communicating across distances and whatever, it's all important and everything, but like when it comes down to it, we are still going to need to like account and provide for our basic material needs, which means that, you know, we need to be connected with the people who are immediately around us, who like live next to us and who upon whom we depend in ways that we don't even know about. Like the way that the world works, and we'll probably get into this. I hope that we'll get into this in the essay on logistics in this volume, but like, you know, we can't really live in the world without depending all at once on everybody else in the world. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like, it's important to organize online and like form groups online and, you know, develop ideas online. But at the same time, it's also important to, and necessary, perhaps more necessary than ever, to, you know, organize with the people around us.
Yeah, which I think is like very important because in a certain sense, like even though the internet does open up a lot of like potentials for, you know, any group to like spread their message and to organize, in other ways, like it really does. I could see like the potential being there for it to be like a sort of a hampering effect where like it really is like a more insidious form of like liberal identitarianism, because like you can get very particular and create all of these like very like niche commodified identities thanks to the internet, and enter like this like extremely detached like virtual space, and which is like basically like quantifiable hits of dopamine is like the currency of the internet. And like, I mean, I think this is just like speaks to like the greater process of the 20th century where like, you know, as we were saying earlier, like most people or a large percentage of people now just work like service industry jobs, like jobs that don't really mean anything, that don't really actually contribute to like basic survival or like the enriching of human life. So a lot of us find ourselves in this situation where we've grown up in this world where we only really know how to do this. Like we don't know how to farm, we don't know how to manufacture things, like we wouldn't necessarily be able to revert to some like more traditional model of society. We're atomized and detached from each other, like people don't know their neighbors, people don't communicate, people are like increasingly just introverted and like within their own little niche groups, and these niche groups are often just identified based on like shared commodity preference.
Right.
So these are big questions. Like these are realities.
I mean, yeah, I think that like it is certainly true that in a new world, in a new utopian world, there will have to be like a proliferation of skills that we have lost, like farming, for example. I think, you know, more people. I think that ultimately we're going to have to do away with cities, certainly as they are structured now. People have to like spread out more, and there will have to be like a greater amount of like personal farming, probably. I don't really know. I don't want to say too much one way or the other. I think in Endnotes number 5 there's an essay on this, but yeah, I think it's true that like, for example, farming, we'll need to learn farming or whatever, but I think that's like kind of like a generational projects where like it's more like our kids or our kids' kids who will really face the burden of that, because like in the more immediate future, like say that we have a revolution, you know, in 10 or 20 years, like the cities aren't going to go away in that long, and we're going to continue to rely on monoculture for the time being, and like the systems are already in place. Like this, like Marx talks about how, in order to attain communism, you need to like go through capitalism just in order to build up the means of production to a state where we could like provide for our material needs. But that shit is all there. Like our productive capacities are far, far greater than I think that we fucking need. Like we're producing way more food than the population of the planet can deal with. It's just not efficiently distributed because of profits and all that.
Yeah. Which is like, I think when it's laid out like that, to me, it like, when you think about it in those sorts of terms, like, I don't know, this is almost where you start to get into the idea of like making some more unified revolutionary identity, because I feel like there's a lot of people, like, people on the right and the left, and like all these different political identities that are all like unified in their idea of like not being satisfied with like the current system.
Yeah.
And like I think like even if you were to talk to these people rationally, even if they had a disagreement about like how the revolution would look, like very big disagreements, let's say, there's probably a lot of like shared vision of like what ideally you would want. Like, yeah, it would be good if people had more like connection to the earth and like knew how to farm, and like there's certain things that are just like fundamental to human life that like should be more promoted instead of just like maximizing profit. And I feel like there's a lot of things that most people, if you really started talking to them about it, would agree would be like a good thing to work towards, is like a revolution. The problem is that like, for some people the revolution is communization, for other it's like the ethno state.
Yeah, totally.
So like, it's that middle like question mark that needs to be dealt with.
Yeah. I don't like thinking about talking to the hoi polloi, because like I feel like they're actually a lot worse than either of us could possibly conceive of. This is what I've learned from Twitter, just like going onto like trending topics, and like the comments to like just like general American politicians, or just like Twitter allows you to have like a peek into like the right wing, into like spheres of culture and society that you and I have no immediate access to. Like we would never be allowed entry into there, and it's fucking horrifying. It's absolutely terrifying.
I think it is good to expose yourself regularly to like those points of view that are very far removed from your own, because like I definitely fall into this trap where I'm like the eternal optimist, where I'm like, just sort of naturally associating with peers who share my worldview, and then I'm extrapolating like, oh, you know what, like those other people that like, we're just having a verbal disagreement, but I'm sure if we all just sat down and talked about it, like, we'd be on the same page. And we'd
talked about it for like 10,000 years or something.
What was that?
Talked about it for 10,000 years. That's a very Habermasian position. Like his whole philosophy, Habermas, like the fucking greatest sellout in the history of Western philosophy.
I feel like this is probably just like a lingering kernel of like ingrained liberalism that I still haven't worked out in my consciousness yet.
Yeah, I mean his whole idea is just basically that like if two people sit down and like talk for long enough and like are genuine about it, then they can come to an understanding, and like all kinds of like disagreements, and even at the highest level of abstraction, can be solved through dialogue and like reason. But Habermas, I don't think he ever used Twitter, and like having used Twitter a little bit, like I fully do not believe that some large portions of the population can be reasoned with. I don't think that they could ever change their mind. And like, Stalin,
that brings up the next question, is like, okay, if we can't get everyone on the same page, then you need to account for the fact that there's going to be a large group of people who are radically other,
who are antagonistic to you, and like that is just. This is like we're talking. Yeah, we're talking about a revolution. What is that like Lenin line? Like you can't go to a revolution with like white kid gloves on or something. Like we're talking about a revolution. There's going to be some violence.
Like something you can't allude to directly
Yeah.
liberal paradigm, but like
The liberal paradigm of
maybe
YouTube.
we're fundamentally there's just no getting on the same page, and like
Yeah.
that's something that we're gonna have to all face, no matter what side you're on.
I
Eventually.
mean, no, if you're on the right side, then you should hold it in your mind forever that you can get on the right side, the same page with us lefties, and you should always you should never go beyond discourse. If you're on the right wing, then you should always just confine yourself to discourse, and there's no legitimate means of doing politics outside of discourse. And I think we should leave it at that.
Yeah.
Volume 3, Section 4.
What section are we on now?
Non-class identities.
Oh, right. So I guess we've kind
Yeah, I don't know.
of started off there and then
Whatever.
spitballed.
Let's just go on to strategic
Section.
visions.
Yeah, that sounds cool. Our boy Jasper Burns.
He's not our boy. Jasper Burns, controversial figure. And we'll leave that off as well. Let's not get into it.
Yeah, they're mostly here. They're just like, again, a lot of this editorial is just kind of like giving a broad overview of what each individual essay is going to be about.
Exactly. The function of an editorial. It's good, good writing, good, work.
Honestly, I'm surprised we've come up with this much to talk about.
Yeah. Hour 3. Burns article. This is the Editorial with Toscana, yeah. Logistics. I think logistics is an interesting topic. It's something that I've thought about a lot in terms of like communism, just like kind of what we were talking about earlier in terms of like farming and like providing for our material necessities, and like the way that the entire globe is just so interconnected. Like the idea of a revolution, like a global revolution, like how are you going to like distribute things where they're needed? And I mean, it's just a very complicated question, and I'm sure there's like a lot of like empirical data that you can bring into that. And like Amazon has basically already solved the problem for us. Like Amazon has already like this amazing means of like storing and shipping like anything, any commodity that you need. So all we need to do is nationalize Amazon. And
this is like a really weird aspect, like if you're an anti-capitalist of any stripe, like you have to acknowledge that there's a lot of like things that are theoretically good or useful that have come out of the capitalist production process. It's just they're consistently being used in a bad way. Yeah,
I mean Amazon in abstract, this idea of like a network of like dispatching commodities or whatever, getting things places, is a good concept. So it's fine, but it's just tied to profits. And
well, it's like the same as like the idea of like the engineering class. Like when you're talking about logistics, like, oh, how are we going to get all this stuff done? It's like hugely technical, and it's like, well, you actually have this entire class of people called engineers who are really good at this kind of stuff, and they like doing it. Yeah. And like they're actually already doing it.
Yeah, they've already done it basically.
Yeah, so it's like when you talk about a revolution, it's not like it's fun to like kind of like imagine yourself with like the Molotov cocktail blowing stuff up But like really it's not going to be like that. It's like, okay, we have a lot of the infrastructure and we just kind of got to shift like on a more abstract level, really, like just like the way people are going to survive within this infrastructure. Like a lot of it's just going to stay the same. Like all these engineers doing stuff, a lot of them like
that's true.
The hydroelectric plants, it's like just keep doing what you're doing. And in fact, like I think that's going to help with a lot of like the so-called normies who just want to like wake up each day and like kind of like if they feel okay with their lives, like just keep doing more or less the same. Like
that's true.
I think this is an important thing to point to. Is like, yeah, you'll be able to do that if you enjoy what you're doing. That's good. It's like
It's true, you know, like this system is already, and we see this right now here in Canada with the CERB. Like
Mm-hmm.
the system already has enough money to basically provide everybody with like what they need
Basic
in order to
survival.
live.
Yeah.
Um, and like is like when we talk about like restructuring our social relationships in some kind of like revolutionary communist way, it can be like really abstract, and like often like don't really have a clear understanding in my head of like what the hell that means. But
Mm-hmm.
like I think what you just said is really true and important. Like largely our society is already set up and it's doing fine, and like we don't need to change a lot of things. Like the
Mm-hmm.
hydroelectricity is coming, the food is being grown, like these humongous farms out in Saskatchewan basically already are run by like
Yeah.
one person. It's just like robots who are like harvesting or whatever, and some like migrant laborers who are being like terribly
Yeah,
exploited,
yeah,
but
yeah.
we can
See,
deal
and
with
these
that.
are the aspects that like we're trying to like
Yeah.
take out and
Yeah,
figure out like, okay, what needs to change? What do we want to
exactly.
change?
But yeah, I think like with that in mind, like it is really just about how we relate to each other and the people around us. Like how are we going to, I don't know, like relate, have social relations and
Yeah.
like interact with people in such a way that like we can have this kind of revolution. I don't know.
Like certainly like I feel like one of the key questions in all of this is like, okay, all of this like I'm not gonna say it's like good or bad, but it is like incredible in like the broadest sense, like the kind of like world that's like emerged, like compared to like, just like how vast it is and how complex it's gotten. Um, and like the driving motive under capitalism to get most people to like take part in the construction of that was like, okay, you need this thing called money in order to account for your basic survival and also like your status and stuff like that. So you're gonna work this thing called a job, and then you're gonna get money in return for it. And this has been like kind of the engine driving it, like this like fundamentally exploitative engine. But like in a more abstract philosophical sense, I feel like the possibility is there for a more like positive and holistic motivating force that doesn't lead to like these contradictions and these things like the surplus population and like this mad dash to develop for the sake of profit, which leads to things like the exploitation of other countries and like environmental degradation. Like there needs to be some sort of positive motivating force that makes people want to voluntarily take part in the expansion of the system at a more measured and conscious kind of like rate, not just like, oh, we gotta maximize production, because they actually want to, because they enjoy living in this world and they think it is good. Like I think for too long, like people have been participating in this thing that feels like it should be good, and yet the actual experience is like frustrating, and you're constantly just worried about bills, you're constantly worried about like being on the street, even if you're making money you're worried you're not making enough money. That all
Mm-hmm.
needs to go away,
Yeah.
like because it's unnecessary. I feel like there's like a healthier and less neurotic way to motivate human beings to like have like a complex industrial society. Maybe not though. Maybe
Yeah.
you disagree with me. Maybe this is where libertarians are coming from. Like maybe
Yeah.
they think that like, you know, that like fire has to be behind you. That like.
Well, it's only because there's the potential to profit, to generate surplus profit, that people are ever going to be motivated to do interesting things, to
Mm,
like do innovations or create new products or like improve the world.
yeah.
Seems a bit nonsense.
Yeah, because like I mean like as we were saying earlier, like a lot of like engineers that I've known, they actually like doing that sort of stuff,
Yeah,
like computer programmers and stuff like programming. Artists like making art just for like the thing in itself.
and
And I'm sure there's people who
yeah,
like farming.
all
There's
of these people would do a much better job with the thing that they like doing if they didn't have to like worry about all of this like extraneous shit, like getting a job and like I don't know, fitting into some other
yeah.
some paradigm, some exploitative paradigm. But when you talk about it in those terms, it kind of makes me think that a revolution is like a cultural thing, like like if it's a matter of changing people's motivation to participate in society away from like the capitalist motivation, like the value form and generating profit for themselves, which is something that has been encultured into people, then it's like a kind of revolution. It's like a cultural project. We have to like change people's minds. We have to like convince people, sway people, move them from holding one set of views to another, from being like competitive and profit motivated to being motivated by like solidarity.
Yeah, you basically need something that's like the opposite of like like that red pill movement on the internet. Like especially in I think it's like kind of shifted in terms of like what that signifies, but like specifically what it was like 10 years ago, where it was supposed to be like, oh, the world's just like this hierarchy and it's all about like your status on the hierarchy, and like no one ever loves you, no one appreciates you, everything's just motivated by profit, and like you may as well just recognize that and like embrace it. You need basically like see, they're not gonna like me saying this, but the anti-red pill that's not like the blue pill, like oh, be like a normie, just like mindlessly participate in it. It's like no, you need like the recognition that there is something beyond either just like this duality of like being like the sheep who's like mindlessly participating in capitalism, or like the red pilled like sees how it really is, sees like this dark Darwinian kind of like relationship playing out and just like exploits it. Like there's like a third path, there's like something else, there's like other potentials for human beings that are like fundamentally other than this definition.
Yeah. Competitive and based on scarcity and cutthroat and brutal. Brutish, nasty, and short.
Like, if there is, like, I don't know why, like, a red pill type would be, like, listening to a communization podcast, but, like, if you are, like, do you actually want that to be reality? Like, do you want to live in that world
they don't,
that is described?
I don't know. I mean, libertarians don't care about society. They only care about themselves.
Yeah, just buying weird drugs off the internet.
Yeah, or just, like, personally not being taxed, but also being able to benefit from everything that taxes get you.
There is certainly, like, a libidinal motivation to, like, being a libertarian or, like, being a capitalist, where it's kind of like, on one level, like, yeah, I think humans do like competition, like, like, that's why we play sports and stuff. So, that's also going to be part of, like, any sort of considerations. Like, there are going to be these aspects of, like, humanity that need to be, like, properly vented in the right place.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if, like, economic competition is real competition, though.
Yeah, it's like, yeah.
So you're really just competing over, like, a finite amount of jobs.
Do you like the Greeks did, and just get everyone oiled up and like wrestling?
Oh my
Like,
god,
take care of
it's so
those,
gross.
like, those competitive instincts, like.
I can't believe you said that. Yeah, that is such a bombshell that I think we're going to end it on that.
Yeah.
You have been listening to the Footnotes to Endnotes podcast. My name is Uriah Marktara. Follow me on Twitter at the inverted form. Owen.
My name is Owen Gilbride. Follow me on the internet at world3.tk. You can get my music, which is all the music that starts off these podcasts. I should have a vinyl 7-inch coming out either later this year or early next year. So.
Oh, cool. When you say follow you on the internet, you mean follow in the loosest sense.
Yeah, because I sort of intentionally shun anything like post 1994.
Your website is very, very like early 2000s. It's like one of these like mysterious kind of websites where you have to like click around and like find clues and shit.
I've made it like entirely text-based now. Like in the last few days, I've shifted it so there's not even any pictures on it anymore. It's just
beautiful.
Pure text. Like I'm really into that sort of like early internet aesthetic.
Great. So follow him down the rabbit hole, and we'll see you next time. Bye.